Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Sally Geyer, CEO here at World Commerce and Contracting, and I am super excited about today's conversation. I have learned an awful lot, and I've been very conscious over the last few weeks, actually, since we did a little preparation call for this webinar about how I hold myself, the way in which I stand, and I've been checking myself on a regular basis. So today we're going to be talking about gender, culture, and body language, some of the myths and facts. And I think some of the facts around it are going to surprise you. Certainly, they've given me a lot to think about. And I'm really delighted to welcome on this virtual stage with me Keld Jensen, who, of course, is our resident negotiation expert, guru extraordinaire. If you don't know about Keld yet, then, well, I'm sure you do. And I'm also delighted that we are joined today by an internationally recognized expert in non-verbal and verbal group dynamics, body language, persuasive and high stakes communication, Sharon Saylor. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my honor to be with you today.
Wonderful. And as ever, you know how much we like to make sure that these sessions are really interactive. I can see the chat happening. Let us know where you're dialing in from today, where you're joining us from, because we're talking about things that are going to matter in the context of a myriad of different cultures. And I know we're going to get on to that point, Sharon, in just a moment. But make sure that you engage. I'm sure you're going to have questions for us, observations of your own as we're going through the next hour. So we look forward to engaging with you using the chat function and the Q&A button if you'd like to as well. So, Keld, with that, we've talked an awful lot about gender and negotiation over the last few months, for the reason that, of course, that reminder that we were informed that women are a rare breed in negotiation. That is a myth which we are trying to bust, but nonetheless, there are some really interesting aspects to gender and body language, particularly.
Yes, Sally. This is it's one of my favorite topics these days. Actually, just last week, I had a client coming to me saying, "How come you talk so much about women and negotiation these days? Is that really important?" And I was almost laughing. And I had a long lecture in front of the gentleman explaining why that was an important topic. So I'm so excited, Sharon. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And we could say, Sally, I guess that this is another chapter in our discussion and sharing information of why gender negotiation and today's topic, body language, is so important. Just before, Sharon, I have a couple of questions for you, and I'm sure Sally has the same. I just want to create a little bit of attention why this topic is so important. First and foremost, we have to recognize negotiation, obviously, and we all negotiate all the time. We negotiate with our spouse, our kids, our manager, our colleagues, our suppliers, our clients. We negotiate all the time. And body language is essential. It's actually the first language we all learn. Think about a baby that hasn't got a verbal language yet. The first language that baby will have is reading body language from the parents. So body language is a language, and it's a very unique science understanding how that works. And Sharon, just in our prep call, we talked about culture and the differences in culture, and obviously gender and the differences between gender is a culture as well, and various parts of the world have different body language culture as well. But when we talk negotiation, if I should just direct it in two general observations, we have positional negotiation, which is I win at your expense or you win at my expense, or we have collaborative negotiation where we promote transparency, openness, honesty. And in the first one, I would say body language is essential because we really have to interpret, understand the counterpart. The second one, body language is important as well. But as I just said, we might be more open, transparent. So we may even talk about body language signals that we don't really understand. So it's important regardless of what direction in negotiation we are taking or what direction we believe in. But Sharon, one of the things we talk about talking genders is stereotypes and biases. And women might be perceived, sometimes I'm generalizing, as less assertive and authoritative in negotiation. That could lead to a misunderstanding of their body language and could obviously affect how negotiation tactics and confidence could be perceived from women in general. But Sharon, what's your take on the whole topic? Well, how would you like to introduce this important topic to our audience today?
Oh my goodness, that's a huge question, Keld. And it's my honor to be here with all of you today. I'd like to start at the 30,000-foot level and do some definitions before we dive into the nitty-gritty here. I'm actually a fan of stereotypes, and I always look at things, there's a negative and a positive side to everything. And the positive side to a stereotype is it gives me a starting place. Gives me a starting place to begin to understand where someone might be coming from. And this is just where someone might, underscore might there, because stereotypes can also lock us into our preconceived biases, our biases we may not even know we have. So we have to be careful. But understanding someone's gender, we can also talk about age is a big difference. I'm noticing some of the questions I'm getting from the senior managers I work with, and paraphrasing here, but it's basically, what do I do with these young people? How do I motivate the Gen Zers is a huge question I'm getting now. So that's also a culture. The other cultures can be, as we said, ethnic cultures is where most people go and think about, how do I deal with different ethnicities? However, where you went to school, where you went to primary school is even important, all the way up to university. I was lecturing at a university not too long ago, and I noticed their primary culture was, if you wanted to fit in, it was a navy blazer, a navy blazer, and gray pants. That was sort of the uniform. It wasn't a required uniform, but I was like, wow, the culture here is that way to dress. It was all very fascinating to me, but it also begins to explain how we approach other people and how we can move past our own biases. I think the primary thing with understanding body language is not reading the other person, but what messages am I sending out that could be affecting the other person? Because if I get a response back that, like, wow, I didn't expect that response, my first place that most people often go is like, what's wrong with them? But then take a moment and reflect back on yourself. Did I just send a message that was culturally inappropriate? Doesn't have to be ethnicity, like I said. Did I just send a message that was culturally inappropriate and they're responding to it unconsciously? That's the whole thing. Oftentimes people aren't consciously aware of the responses they're getting back or the responses they're giving. It's an instantaneous thing. If you're triggered, and it's an instantaneous thing. So what I love to tell people is the primary body language to understand about ourselves is to monitor our breathing. That is the first thing you're judged on when you walk into a room, regardless of your ethnicity, whatever. You can be wearing the wildest clothes, the loudest, the craziest, the most, as the culture of that room might say, inappropriate clothing, and people will be okay. Oddly enough, you might be seen as eccentric if you're breathing low and slow and comfortable in your own skin.
All right. I think that's the first great piece of advice. Not always that easy, Sharon, especially if
No,
you
I'm
are
not, I didn't. Simple, but not easy. How's that? To me,
no, but it
breathing
is without a doubt
reaction.
a great advice. Now, Sharon, just back to the box of great advices that you could share with our audience, especially diving into genders and negotiation. What is it that if you are a woman in negotiation, and that's kind of what we've been spending time on previously, as a woman in a negotiation, should you mirror your counterpart, especially if it's a male counterpart, in your body language, or should you rest in your own? Or what kind of advice would you share on that specific question?
Oh, that is a tough question because sometimes mirroring somebody is almost physically impossible. Oftentimes, and I'm generalizing here, okay, but oftentimes in negotiation, if someone, especially male, tends to get a little more anxious or excited, they get bigger. It's an interesting phenomenon. You're like, I don't remember them being that broad or something. They really get much bigger and they lean in. That might not be the best response if you lean in too. That could be aggravating the unconscious, maybe conscious aggression that's happening on the other side. But it doesn't mean you shrink either. It means you stand in your own. You breathe comfortably, you breathe low and slow. And as long as you know you're safe, like physically safe, just keep telling yourself, I'm okay. I'm okay. This is going to be okay.
Right.
Because if we let our mind run away with us on some of the different movements I see in negotiations, people sometimes come into them. I know we talked about the idea of rapport and generosity and sharing and openness and negotiation, and that's an ideal. I don't see that in some negotiations I sit in on.
Sharon,
Someone comes with a preconceived notion of power.
Sharon, it is interesting. And I remember this from my earlier practitioner days. In fact, there was a big phenomenon around neuro-linguistic programming, NLP at the time, but also how you, so talking about mirroring, how you find yourself unconsciously, subconsciously mirroring the other person, that you're both leaning your arm on the table with your this, your hand and your, or that, or you're sitting back, and you suddenly realize that in fact you're doing the same thing, or you're consciously, a la NLP, mimicking the other person.
Mimicry always looks like mimicry. I'm sorry. Even if someone doesn't consciously know it's mimicry, they'll feel odd. Like, what are they doing? It's not right. Because mirroring isn't always exact. You doing this and then I do that. That's mimicry. But if you do this and then I just gently lean in like this a little closer to you, because this is actually a lean in. So if I just lean in on my elbow a little closer to you, that can be rapport building. So it doesn't have to be mirroring it. True mirroring isn't an identical mirroring, because then people are like, what are they doing? They're manipulating me. It reminds me of my siblings. Do you remember maybe this game of like, stop copying me, stop copying me? And we have that in our brain. It's still wired there that if someone does very manipulative mirroring, it always backfires. It really depends on your intention and the place the other person's coming from. If they're coming from a place of power and they're doing power type body language things, the more comfortable you can be with yourself, the more comfortable you are and breathing low and slow and just letting it wash, around you and not responding to it. There are two things that can happen, and that's one is that they'll back down. They're like, okay, this is impenetrable. They're fine. I'm not going to knock them off their base. Or they'll escalate. And it's important to understand that when someone begins to escalate, you can enlarge yourself without being aggressive. You can sit forward, you can sit up. You can do all sorts of things to change the situation. I've even seen people lean back in the chair and sort of a, I don't care, keep doing whatever you're doing type of move. But it's not an escalation where you want to mirror someone's doing some sort of aggressive move. You don't want to get equally aggressive, because then that can take it out of proportion.
Sally, you're an assertive woman, right? And I've often experienced, unfortunately, the world is not fair, that some assertive women that are assertive equally as a man are sometimes perceived aggressive. And I've seen that happen in negotiation as well, where just a confident woman who's just acting in an assertive way are perceived by the counterpart, the male counterpart, as being extremely aggressive. Is that something you've experienced in your career, Sally?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Keld. I've experienced lots of negotiations in my time, and I think negotiations where people get very irate and start throwing things across the room, it can get quite interesting, can't it? And I'm sure the audience has got a lot of examples as well. I do recall, though, from a cultural perspective, one negotiation where, and I was very young. I was in my 20s, and it was the first negotiation that I'd been sent by myself, albeit with my two sales counterparts, who were both men. And this was a negotiation with a Japanese bank. And it was a very extraordinary and affronting experience because I was the only female in the room and nobody would make eye contact with me on the other side of the table. It was a very traditional boardroom with 6 or 7 gentlemen on the other side of the board table and myself and my two counterparts on our side. And I wasn't really sure how to handle that particular situation, and I did so. And actually, Sharon, it's so nice because, and I don't get it right, and I can't wait to talk about tilting heads and crossing legs because I've got a really funny story on that one to tell as well, that just happened this weekend. But in that particular instance, something must have come over me where I did stay calm, and I thought, well, the only way to handle this situation is by staying calm, having my hands on the table, referring to my colleagues when I needed to, and speaking directly to the people on the other side of the table that I was negotiating with, even though they were sending their eye contact in the other way. And yeah, the negotiation went well. It was fine. We got what we needed to get. But I have never, well, quite clearly, because it's some, 30, well, it's not quite that long later, but certainly 25 years later. And I still I can remember that boardroom like I walked into it yesterday.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sharon, I was thinking, if we talk nonverbal behavior in a negotiation and we talk like normal common behavior like smiling, nodding, using gestures, is that something that could undermine a woman's perceived confidence and authority compared to a man? Is that something a woman, specifically talking gender, have to be more aware of than a man?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Eye contact, and then we'll talk about Sally's tilted head comment there. Eye contact is one that's really interesting. And there's research on this. It's not just an idea. There's research on this that when two men make eye contact, it can escalate any aggression. They can almost feel like a conflict can escalate if it's prolonged eye contact. You want to make eye contact. It's not like always looking away from them. But if you make it, instead of consistent, you make constant eye contact, two men make constant eye contact, it creates aggression. However, if two women, it's make constant eye contact, it almost becomes like, oh, your best buds, you're with your BFF all of a sudden, which is an interesting place to be too, if you don't know the person, but that constant eye contact. Now, the interesting thing here in this conversation was, what if it's one male and one female? What happens is it creates an unusual attention. The tension can build up and it becomes uncomfortable, because if we think about when do we make sort of those constant eye contact, and some of the research shows it's that term of like we're in puppy love, oh, I just want to gaze into your eyes. And what happens is people become very uncomfortable in mixed gender, male, female, where two people are making eye contact that's too constant. So I always share, make consistent eye contact, but it's also okay to look around the room. It's also okay to look at someone next to them or look outside, whatever it is, because you don't want that constant eye contact, because it can escalate in a myriad of ways that it's difficult to undo once it's started.
And of course, Sharon, in that context, it can be used as a weapon, I guess.
Oh, easily, if you want to manipulate. Yeah, absolutely.
Having that permanent piercing eye contact can make an individual feel very uncomfortable.
And that's where I say go back to breathing. If you notice someone giving you what I call the death stare, they're doing it on purpose. Right? Either that or you have spinach in your teeth, but that's the only thing, to understand. Because if they're giving you that death stare, they're trying to unnerve you. And if they can't unnerve you, it actually unnerves them. They're off their game. If they come in and this is my game, I am going to stare down Keld. and they just keep staring, and you keep breathing, and you're like, whatever, dude. You know?
No, but honestly, I think what you just said is brilliant because the next time that happens, you just say, "Sorry, do I have spinach in my teeth?"
Exactly.
I
You know,
remember that
it's a
one.
game. You have to understand what games are people playing with you. And as long as you refuse to play the game, it can end up the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
I love classes like this because we're coming from a place of wanting to have community and sharing and common agreement. And yet not everybody does come from that place. And
No.
just having the awareness of I can stay centered and wanting to come from building together agreement, community, relationship, and still be aware that someone's trying to manipulate the situation nonverbally. Because the interesting thing about nonverbal communication is, I like to say, you always have plausible deniability. So say, Sally, I call this person out with that joke about spinach, and they're like, who, me? What are you talking about? Or something like that, right? They know they've been caught then, but they have plausible deniability because it's just your interpretation of their stare down, and they realize they've been caught.
Right. Sharon, one thing that I typically promote is transparent, open, honest negotiation. And that is not always working, as you just made a comment of in the beginning. But one of the things that I often encourage my client and students to do is actually opening up negotiation and as part of the agenda, addressing trust, transparency, openness. And that would include, for instance, addressing a topic like if you find or don't understand the counterpart's body language, that you are allowed to comment on that. So we basically build it into the agenda with the counterpart saying if trust is declining, we're allowed to verbalize that. If we misunderstand body language, we're allowed to interpret that and verbalize that. So we're basically trying to move negotiation from this game playing thing where we're trying to figure out what is the counterpart doing, just down to being 2, 3, 4 people, human beings sitting talking to each other. Now that is not always working, but what's your take on actually starting off talking about the elephant in the room, genders, body language, trust, transparency, and so on?
There has to be already a high level of trust to have that conversation. So it would really, I hate to use this kind of thing, but context always matters. How well do you know this other group? Is it the first meeting, the first time you've ever seen their faces? Is very different than someone that you have at least a relationship, maybe a phone relationship, Zoom relationship with, and now all of a sudden you're in a meeting room. I think it's excellent to come from that place. But it also can be difficult to get everyone on board with that. Some people will verbalize, oh yeah, sure, that's where I'm coming from. And yet go, okay, I see that community building is their weakness.
Yeah.
Negotiation can come from 2 places, and that's productivity, get it done at all costs, and community building. And to me, it has to be a nice blend of both. Let's get the product done. Let's get it, the productivity part. But if someone is stuck in productivity, that idea of community, they'll be giving it lip service, but in their mind is waste of time.
Yeah.
Interesting, when you have that initial conversation is either you or someone is assigned to observe, are there body language signals of non-agreement? It could be as simple as looking left, the other party look left to right very quickly. That often means they're looking for safety amongst their peers. So you're bringing up this conversation, Keld, about let's have this freedom of expression and all this. And if the other parties are looking side to side very quickly to each other, they're trying to decide, is that safe? Can I agree to that? And will the other parties agree to it?
Right.
Or if someone rolls their eyes. Now, in as adults, it's usually a really quick eye roll, not like your teenagers. Adolescence, the eye roll is really extended forever, right? With the chin up. You won't,
Yes.
you might see that in negotiations, but it's rare. But you'll see a real quick eye roll, just a real quick flash of the head, tip of the head and a quick eye roll. That means the person's feeling unsafe. Eye roll typically is they disagree with you, or it's a feeling of the other party feeling unsafe. So if that's the case, you're starting to see any of these minor little micro aggressions or micro movements, and you know that those are commonly dealt with on safety, then we have to backtrack our conversation a little bit more to build a firmer foundation that this is a safe environment. You won't, there's no, retribution or anything like that. If all of a sudden I'm talking about safety, I'm not going to turn on you and make it unsafe.
Right.
Keld, a question for you then. I think this is really interesting in the context of and especially what Sharon said in the context, is it the first time you've met each other? But having somebody as an observer in a negotiation is not an uncommon thing. I don't know whether that's something that you encourage in the context of trying to create that transparency and essentially safety. I mean, we just in our board meetings, we always appoint a board monitor, and that board monitor is there. Yes, they're part of the board, so it's not somebody extra, but their role, as well as contributing to the conversation, is just to observe the quality of the meeting and body language and all sorts of different things, and then to feed back at the end. And I completely understand, Sharon, what you say about that sense of safety, because of course we feel in a safe environment, and we seek to make new board members feel safe. But having that observer role, Keld, how important is that? And I imagine, again, it's contextual.
That's a great question, Sally. I'm involved many times every year in negotiation as a facilitator, where I'm not hired by one side or the other side to represent them in a negotiation, but the role is to assist both parties in trying to achieve the best possible result. Some would call it a mediator, but it doesn't have to be a mediator role, because it doesn't have to be disagreement before we're sitting there. It could just be the facilitator to help them achieve that. Now, what is critical, obviously, for me to succeed with the people around the table is that everybody have trust in me. They have to believe I'm objective. They have to believe that I service everybody's best interest. But if we have achieved that, then that works quite often very well. Because back to what you said, and I didn't know you did that, Sally, but I love that observation role. I think that's really great you're doing it, because that gives a lot of benefit. And the same thing, it's very comparable to what you're just asking about negotiation, having somebody sitting there and basically just support both parties in trying to achieve the better result. And quite often, and I'm generalizing, negotiation fails regardless of genders because of miscommunication, because of lack of information sharing, because of not understanding each other's rules. And I've been talking about this many times, so I'm not going to spend much time on it right now, but we all perceive negotiation very differently. Sharon, you may perceive it as playing tennis. I may perceive it as playing chess. And women and men might perceive negotiation differently as well. One might be, I'm generalizing, more competitive than the other one. So we have different understanding of negotiation before we arrive at the table. And back to what I said earlier, that's why I feel it's quite often sometimes to negotiate and how to negotiate before we start negotiating. And that is, I completely agree with everything you said, Sharon. It all down to, do we have a relationship? Is there trust? Do we believe in the same approach to negotiation? And we don't necessarily do that. Now, Sharon, I have a quick question to you. Obviously, we have a global audience here today. And I guess body language is not just one standard thing around the world. I mean, not only are we talking genders, and that's a cultural differences, but I guess body language in Asia could be different than North America and South America, right? And what is it that you as a negotiator, regardless of genders, what is it that you should be aware of? And I know we could probably spend just 5 hours discussing the global culture of different body languages, but could you give us some pieces of advice on what we should be aware of?
Oh, absolutely. My first one, if you know that you're in absolutely going into a different culture, is educate yourself on the basics of the culture, at least the basics. And that's finding people from that culture that can educate you. There are certain hand gestures that people in the US do all the time that are incredibly offensive on big parts of the world, right? The okay sign, the peace sign, what we call the peace sign here, those are incredibly offensive to certain cultures. And yet we do those unknowingly. There are certain cultures that I'm thinking of a time when I was traveling abroad, and the people I was with, I had never thought about this the movement is like sign my check when you would do to a waiter who's far away. That's the movement. That was incredibly offensive in this culture, and I was really surprised at that one. But it's important to know. I mean, the common ones are written about, like I said, the okay sign.
Right.
But to understand some of these differences, and when you are surprised, the surprise is the enemy of competence. So if you are surprised in a negotiation, I feel it's okay to ask for more explanation. Saying, oh, okay, I'm noticing, or could you explain a little bit more? Now, it's not calling them out on the carpet. It's just, I'm curious. Come from that place of, I wonder, I'm curious. Did I just step in it kind of thing, which you may do if you're not familiar with the culture. But
Right.
then also, if you're coming from that culture, like here in the States, we have very different cultures. Just even within our states, you can you can go across the border here and be in a completely different culture.
Yeah.
But coming from that place of I wonder and curiosity, people appreciate that. They're willing to tell you what happened or what, to be aware of. And they
Right.
appreciate when you're open and honest with them that, hey, look, I'm out of my element here.
Right.
What's going on? Now,
Right.
I wanted to circle back about the observer role. What I love about that is always a great place to help build safety when there's an observer role. It's not always a complete option to have, but if you train yourself that when you see a surprise or something you don't understand, you're like, this isn't going the way I want it to go, train yourself to go to the observer role. Take a moment, breathe deep. In a moment where someone else is talking, go to the observer role and look down on the situation and go, okay, what are the entire dynamics of the room? Are there 5 people on this side and 3 on this side, and the 3 on this side are feeling threatened by the larger group? You can see a lot when you take yourself to that observer role.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Sharon, we got a great question or observation from Juliet here saying, watching a person's actions while negotiating with them, quite a lot going on at one time. And I would agree with that. When you prepare your negotiation, you have your content, you have your question, you have your agenda, you have the variables, you have the mathematics, you have a lot of stuff going on. And then on top of that, Sharon, now we're sitting here talking about that you have to be very aware of the nonverbal language, read the body language, and be aware of your own. And that is true what Juliet has said. There's a lot of stuff going on. Do you have any techniques to how do we cope with all of that at the same time? Because it's really information overload here, isn't it?
It is. And I trust your intuition. You may not have seen that microaggression. You might have not have seen something go on, but all of a sudden you're like, something just happened. I don't know what happened, but trust your intuition that something shifted. So you're more mindful of, okay, I'm going to try and figure out what just happened. Oftentimes we might not see it, but we felt it. And so it's an interesting concept to understand. Also, in a lot of negotiations, if there's more than one person in the room, somebody can be assigned that to pay more attention to the eye roll, to pay more attention to a microaggression, to pay more attention. One time I was sitting in that observer role for a team. And what I kept noticing was the lead negotiator kept doing what I would call was a facial expression, a micro expression of withholding. And I'm thinking to myself, why would they be in a negotiation? What are they withholding, right? This is okay. They're not open. Keep seeing this person do the withholding micro expression. And during a break, I mentioned that. And what happened, the lead negotiator and this person were friends. Long story short, they were withholding something from their friend, and it had nothing to do with what was going on in the room. It had something to do about their friendship. And so it was a personal issue, not between them, but it was sort of like they've been wanting to tell this person, their friend, this personal thing. And that's what's interesting to me. We have to be careful that we don't assume that everything we see is about what's going on in the room.
Right.
It can be as extreme as the person's relationships that you've had prior, and they're like, oh, I just want to tell them this, or I want to get this done, or I don't want to hurt their feelings. So understanding that it's a delicate balance. And I say that our gut, and may not truly be your stomach, but that's the terminology, the intuition you have is
Yeah.
usually pretty strong. So I would say
Right.
trust your intuition.
Right. Yeah. I love that, Sharon. I completely agree with you. We have to remember when we're negotiating, especially when we're negotiating in a team, some people only perceive negotiation as the negotiating happening with a counterpart across the table. But we certainly have a lot of negotiation going on within our own team, right? You know,
Or in our own head.
oh, and absolutely in our own head as well. I agree with you. And we sometimes have to negotiate with management, you know, in the back office as well. So we have really three negotiations going on at the same time while we are sitting there negotiating with the counterpart. Now, one of the angles here, Sally and Sharon, is obviously especially promoting women in negotiation. And for those of you who haven't watched us earlier, science is this is a fact, not just an opinion as well, is that women, and we're generalizing obviously, are stronger negotiator than men for several reasons. But I've often find that women are a little bit more, they lack confidence in negotiation, or they don't like to negotiate. So when I'm running workshops and doing keynotes and having clients out there, I often see a majority of men, it's more male dominated still, to negotiate, which I every day feel is a shame, because mixed gender teams seem to outperform purely male teams, and women have a tendency to be better in certain areas in negotiations than men. So, Sharon, one of the things I would love that our audience could leave with today is kind of a, I don't know whether we should call it a top 3 or 4 or 5 of things that could improve a woman's nonverbal language in negotiation. Because as we talked about when we started, a woman should probably not do the same thing as a man are doing in a negotiation. At the same time, she also have to be respected and gain some kind of equal level. And unfortunately, I have experienced, and I think you have too, Sally, men that are trying to abuse their dominant position or trying to create a very dominant position. I just saw in one of the comments out here, which is terrible. What was it? Was that Juliet as well that said that in the beginning of a negotiation, the counterpart, a man, asked her to park his car, and she rejected that, thank God, and gained that respect. And sometimes I'm just sitting there shaking my head about all these hilarious games that perhaps more men than women are playing to create that. And so Sharon, I'm sorry, it was a long opening to the question, but do we have kind of a top 3, 4, 5 things that is just essential for a female negotiator to be aware of, something that she should think of?
Oh, absolutely. And on the parking car, bravo for saying no.
Yeah, indeed.
Regardless of the power
And
dynamic.
And Mandy, thank you for sharing that as well. Because I think, again, the more we share these sort of examples and stories, the easier it is to handle future scenarios. Let's put it that way.
Here's a quick example, and then I'll get into the tips. This was another one which was interesting to me. A group told the women to wear dark clothes. The women of the team that were negotiating, wear dark clothes so you'll fit in. That's not what happened. They faded in. The dark clothes becomes the shadow behind the lead negotiator.
Right.
So I think that's a conversation amongst your team that you have to understand. Is this an equal team, or are we are the support people supposed to fade into the background? So that was just another interesting conversation you have amongst your team about the power dynamics. That's an interesting thing. My top one, and Sally alluded to it, is the tilted head. A lot of women prefer to tilt their head when they listen. And a lot of them shake their head in a sort of this yes, yes, yes sort of thing. It's meaning, yes, I'm still listening. Yet males often go, yes, she's agreeing with everything I'm saying. And so oftentimes you'll have complete miscommunications. They'll say, but during the whole negotiation, you were agreeing with me. Why are you being so stubborn now at the close? And the woman is going, what are they talking about? I was doing 90% of the listening. Yet your nonverbals were the tilted head says submissive, and then the nodding says yes, yes, yes to male counterparts. So being very aware that I like to say, know where your chin is in space. Instead of worrying, do I tilt my head? Most women have one way they constantly tilt. It's more comfortable, but is know where your chin is in space. I also see this with young people. A lot of the Gen Zers I work with cannot level their chin, make it parallel to the ground. They have this text neck, and I tell them, I say, like, make eye contact with me. And they
Right.
are making eye contact out of the top of their eyes, and I said, lift your chin parallel to the ground because that shows confidence. When your chin is parallel to the ground, your head is not going to be either left or right, and you're not
Mm,
going to look scared or insecure with your chin down. So know where your
mm,
chin is in space is number one.
right.
B is if you're standing as a
Sharon,
woman.
I just wanted to jump in on that because I think, when we had our prep call and we talked about this, and I tilt my head and I do a lot of nodding, and that's, that is, and I have become, and I know you're going to come on to the next one, and I've got a story after that as well. But it is so interesting because, there was a huge part of me that sort of felt, well, if I'm tilting my head, I'm demonstrating that I'm listening and I'm being kind, and yeah, if I'm nodding, then I'm listening and not necessarily agreeing, but taking on board what you're saying. So that misperception of what I feel that I'm doing and how it's received, it's really, really interesting. Um,
Absolutely. Two women can be talking and their heads be in a submissive position and nodding, and they're okay. They get it that you're not saying yes. They get it that you're acknowledging you're listening.
yeah.
But if you're in mixed gender group, statistics show that if you tilt your head, men assume you're a pushover and you're submissive.
So from here on in, you'll the audience will know now. I'm keeping my head really straight. I have a book on top of it, a ruler down my back.
Yeah, so that's my number one that I see the most often. The second one I see most often, and this is in the standing position. So as you enter the room or you're in some sort of pre-conference or post-conference type of thing, you can do it sitting too, but it's technically when you're standing. Women cross their ankles when they stand.
Mm,
Now, I get it. I wear high heels too. I understand that that relaxes my lower back. It actually is a physiological thing to take the pressure off wearing
mm,
high heels. Men don't
mm,
wear high heels, so they don't understand the dynamics of how strong your legs have to be to walk in those things.
mm, mm,
So, but when we cross our ankles, what it says is little girl, and pardon me, but it also says
mm,
I have to pee. And so
mm,
both of those make you look littleish, little child. And we do not want to give that as we're waiting to go into the conference room or whatever it is, to give that impression that something is wrong with us. We're either in this place of little girl or
right.
that other one. And now I just want to do a side note. The interesting part is men do a similar move, but it's not with their ankles. They do what I call the fig leaf with their
Mm,
hands, they do
mm,
that. That also says I'm small, I'm young, reverting to adolescence. And it's
mm,
very uncomfortable for us to uncross our legs and realize that we should stand on both of our legs looking firm and balanced. And it's equally uncomfortable to undo the fig leaf because then what do we do with these hands?
mm,
I get it, but it's important to send the right message and just be uncomfortable.
So
mm,
I have spent many, many years wearing high heels and crossing my legs exactly the way you have just described. And again, that was a sort of moment for me when we had our prep call a few weeks ago, and I realized, and so I've been super self-conscious ever since, and I've been speaking at events, I've been all over the place, as I always am, and and I've been trying to be, very sort of conscious about my feet together, my head, everything. I think I've nailed it. Except this weekend, I went to a family party, and maybe it was because I was just sort of not thinking as and being as deliberate about it. I crossed my legs, and then I suddenly realized that I was doing it, and I tried to uncross them, and I nearly fell over myself by trying to uncross and stand normally again. So, note to self and advice to everybody else: you'll be very careful as you're trying to uncross your legs again.
But a note I see body language is contextual. My friends know that I don't read them when we're having coffee or at a party. That's turn it off. Just, oh, that's Sharon, or that's Susan, oh, that's Sally, oh, that's Keld. Doesn't make a difference, really. We're not negotiating. We're just being ourselves. So be yourselves. And I say be yourselves in all relationships, but there are certain things we can do that are ourselves, but change the perception of these unconscious messages we're giving that do not serve us in our confidence and our success and all of those sorts of things. But you're right. The idea of uncrossing your legs. Yes, do it slowly and get used to it. Because if we do it any movement we do too quickly will attract attention.
Mm.
So, if you've been doing this for an hour and all of a sudden, Sally's story runs through your head like, oh, and you do that, people are, what just happened? Is she okay? Are we having a medical event? So
Right,
anytime you
right,
catch yourself doing this, just like
right,
take a nice deep breath and just slowly regain
right.
the right position that makes a more positive, less submissive look.
Mm. Sharon, another thing, not specifically body language, but related, tone and pitch of voice. I think obviously we convey a lot of messages through our tone and pitch of voice, and men, as a general rule, as well, change their pitch and their voice as well when they get aggressive or annoyed or what have you. But just back to genders, is there anything women in general should be aware of regarding their voice in a negotiation?
Absolutely. Choose your voice pattern. Are you the captain of the plane or the flight attendant? They have two different voice patterns. Doesn't matter about gender. If you listen to a captain, whatever their gender, they have the same voice pattern. It's
Mm,
flat and it drops at the period. It's flat and then it drops. That's the
mm,
command voice pattern. That's what, people say is a male voice pattern. It's not. I like to look at the
mm,
captain of the plane has that same voice pattern regardless of their
mm,
gender.
mm.
It's in charge, it's matter of fact, and then you slightly drop your chin. It's not a chin drop like that. It's just tightening your vocal cords by dropping your chin.
Right, right.
It changes
Okay.
your voice pattern. Think of Bond, James Bond.
Mm,
What that character does is they drop at that end where they go. And that
mm,
sounds like that's who I am. I am who I am.
mm,
The other
mm.
one, the flight attendant, regardless of gender, does a real sing-songy type of voice pattern. And the way to get that is you move your chin up and down and it changes the pressure on your vocal cords. And it's like, how are
Interesting.
you today? And it
Right,
usually goes up. That was a question, but even if you fasten your
mm,
seatbelts, it's a
right,
very sing-songy. And I call that the community voice pattern. So
mm,
choose your voice pattern. If you want to
right,
change the dynamics, either go to the captain of the plane or become the
right,
flight attendant.
right. So now we talked about the position of our legs, our gestures, our voice. What's left, Sharon? I guess there's facial expression as an important part as well, right?
Well, facial expression is important, but I'd love to go to hand gestures
Mm-hmm.
because that is cultural too. There are certain
Mm-hmm.
cultures that the gestures are wide, they're
Mm-hmm.
immense, and and there are other cultures that the gestures are very small and contained and compact. And then there are gestures where people tell a story and they walk you through the story, right? Oh, and by the way, if you are a speaker and on stage a lot and you're telling a story, go right to left because it looks left to right from the observer, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Unless, of course, some of the Asian cultures go right to left and then, but know which way people read and do your gestures that way in reverse. It's a trained skill, okay? Not to get too deep I did just get deep in the swamp there, didn't I? But hand gestures, there's three main hand gestures and they're cross-cultural just to understand them. And the first is the upward palm gesture. Now, of course, on Zoom, I have to do it higher than I normally do it. This is sort of a waist height thing, but here to observe it. And this is all about relationship. This is all
Mm-hmm.
about wanting to share. This is all about sometimes you can hand someone the invisible mic this way and and that's really a nice open way to share. This is a sharing hand gesture.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got someone with a nefarious kind of background in the negotiation, they'll call it a beggar gesture. And a beggar gesture, I think, is very unfair. But this whole idea is about sharing. The other one that's very common is not open to negotiation. And that's the downward palm gesture. You can do it with both hands. It's very serious. It's like, no. One hand is like a no, but it's also a way that people will try to get you to back down. They'll start using the downward palm gesture because we get this gesture from the time we're toddlers. Your parents will look at you with a downward palm gesture and you're like, no, don't do that, right? So it sparks us to understand this is a very powerful gesture. knowing that it means not open to negotiation is fine. I can work another way around to see what is the problem in the negotiation, but don't let it trigger you, okay? A lot of people see this gesture and they immediately go to that little scared 5-year-old. It just means no, it's not a reprimand, but a lot of people feel it as a reprimand. So understand that's what's happening with this gesture. And hey, if you want to use it for that, go ahead. I mean, you can use it for whatever you want to, but the one that I see as gender, a lot of gender differences, is that the women tend to use a side palm gesture much more than men.
Okay.
Kind of a easy way, a community building, a rapport way to say no. But the problem is women think they're saying no when they say this gesture, especially if it's a chop motion. They think
Right.
they're saying no, but to everyone else, they're saying, well, maybe. I'm in the middle. I'm not being totally open and I'm not being totally closed.
Right.
And yet women can give a command to their team with this gesture. And half of the team, usually male, just go, oh, well, she said Tuesday, but I'm sure we can, squeeze it to Wednesday and everything will be fine. So
Right.
understanding that this gesture can get you in a lot of trouble. If you want to use it as compromise, perfect. But
Right.
be aware that's what you're saying when you use this gesture.
Right. What I often see, Sharon, is the more aggressive negotiator is the one using the pointing finger, right? And the response I sometimes observe from the counterpart is this reaction, as a response to the aggressive negotiator. What would be a more appropriate response to that nasty negotiator sitting there pointing their finger at you?
Ignore it.
Okay. Well, that's a great piece of advice. Yeah.
Ignore, and people don't take the concept of ignoring things well enough, because what they're trying to do with that gesture is get you off your base, get you off
Right.
balance, get you off your center, get you into revert you to adolescence or below, like that little 5-year-old kid getting scolded, right? That's what that is. And they may do it on purpose. There are certain people that understand body language well enough to say, okay, you know what? I'm not getting what I want. I'm going to use the finger. There are people that just use the finger, or the chopping finger is even worse. That is just
Right.
scold, scold, scold.
Right.
My thing is breathe through it. Do not allow yourself get regressed. And oftentimes you'll feel you've regressed, and it's about how fast can you come back to center? How fast can you come back to where you want to go? I had a mentor tell me years ago that when I was learning all of this, he said to me, it's not about perfection, it's about recovery. So the faster you notice, okay, I got the pointed finger, I regressed to 5 years old, and maybe it took me a minute to calm myself last time. And I'm going to cheer myself on because this time it only took me 20 seconds to recover from that pointed finger. So knowing that it's not about perfection, it's about recovery.
Right.
I struggle not to laugh at somebody pointing their finger at me like that. If somebody's pointing their finger at me, I mean,
although I would not suggest laughing externally could escalate the situation. I certainly would be laughing internally. But yes,
I you, Sharon. It's very much about staying calm. Actually, one would argue it's talking about taking somewhat of the moral high ground in the situation as well.
Right. That might be a great story, outside the room, whatever. But oftentimes if someone is, you can tell if they're doing it seriously. And if they're very intent on doing the wagging finger, yeah, it's best just to breathe. As I said, breathing is the key component to nonverbals. It makes your nonverbals smooth. It makes your voice smooth. So if you take away just one thing from today, and that's learn to master your breathing. Low and slow always sounds confident. You have enough breath to finish your story. High and rapid, which is where we go when we get nervous or feel threatened or unsafe. And I'll try and do it now. High and rapid, you'll see my voice changes, it begins to crack, and maybe I've just aggravated half of or more of the audience.
Yeah.
So let's all take a deep breath, because I just activated everybody's fight or flight mechanism with that voice pattern.
Sure, absolutely. I completely agree, Sharon. One thing that I tend to use and advise people on is exactly what you're saying, but also inhaling before you start talking. So when you get a question, take a break, pause, inhale, and then start talking while you exhale. That will calm everything down as well. It sounds easy. It's not that easy when you're sitting in a very tense negotiation, but I think it's a very important advice, Sharon, that we definitely should share with everybody, and they should take that away. I completely agree with that. Sharon, I think I mentioned it before, but I had a woman a few weeks ago saying she was in a negotiation once where the counterpart looked at her and said, "Aren't you too short to negotiate?" And she was tempted, obviously, to say, "Aren't you too ugly to negotiate?" But she didn't. But
Bravo
anyway,
for her.
my question is, and I know we're talking about breathing, but when you get provoked, when you get surprised like that, is there what else could you do? Is there anything you could do? Because non-verbally, we have a tendency to react, right? When we get surprised, when we get humiliated, whatever. And obviously that serves what the counterpart is trying to achieve. So we shouldn't do that. So Sharon, if you were sitting on the receiving end of an insult like that, what would you do? Breathing, obviously, we learned that, but what else would you do?
That is so contextual. It would depend on my relationship with anybody else in the room. I
Right.
mean, and it would also depend, to me, negotiation is about three things: who has the power, who has the information, and who has the time.
Right.
So it would also depend on the power dynamic to do that. There again, I would just let it go and ignore it. It could be a retort, like not too ugly, but it could be a retort of something about height is inconsequential or something. I would I would say breathe through that one and try to ignore it for the most part, but make note of it, because this person will continue to poke you until they find the part that, oh, short doesn't bother them. What else would bother them?
Yeah, sure.
So
Sure.
that would be that place where it would be great to have the observer, or to reference if we've had that conversation beforehand about fair play and community, and this is about getting the job done.
Sure.
But that person is doing, when they say something like that, that's like parking the car. That's the power play. That's to
Sure.
get you off.
Sally, how would you react?
I don't think you want to know.
That's why
That
I'm
was my
asking you.
first
I would love to
response.
know.
And it could very easily happen to me, given my height as well. But yes, that is an extraordinary thing for somebody to say, and I think perhaps that may be the way I would initially react. Sharon, the other thing I was going to ask you is, and Keld as well, from your experience, at what point do you say, actually, I need to walk away from this person because it's frankly silly? So it's impossible to, it's pointless trying to breathe through it. It's impossible to deal with the situation. There are moments, aren't there, where you actually have to say enough.
Absolutely. Take a break. I suggest scheduling breaks beforehand, because you can always go, okay, it's like 3 more minutes until an agreed upon break.
Right.
So that's the easiest, and that's the socially acceptable first. But take care of yourself first. If you need to get up and walk out of the room, splash some cold water on your face before you explode, absolutely. Take care of yourself first. That's the important part. And see, it's all about context. I would have a problem continuing to negotiate with someone beyond that initial contact if that was their mindset. Yeah. I wouldn't, it would depend. Is like there's someone above them to talk to about this person's behavior is absolutely unacceptable.
Right. Right.
Or if you have the position and the authority, talk to them yourself about that as an unacceptable place to start the conversation.
Right. Right.
It all depends on, I hate that when people say, well, it depends, but it really depends on your position in the pecking order of who, as I said, power, information, and time are critically important. And I just want to say time always wins, regardless of who has the power. Time always wins.
I love your advice about the pause, the break, Sharon. I think a lot of negotiator forgets that's a tool we have in the toolbox, right? And we don't have to sit in a meeting saying, God, I'm offended now or stressed or whatever. Just use an excuse saying, I need to go to the restaurant. I need to go and make a call. I need to go get a cup of coffee, whatever. Just leave the room for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. That could, reestablish the whole thing. And you know, in the world of sports, you have a lot of sports where you have timeouts, right? It serves the same purpose. So if I should leave one piece of advice to our viewers today, that's definitely think about pauses, you know, especially if you get surprised by the counterpart. Ask for a break. It's absolutely legal and acceptable to walk out for 4 or 5 minutes.
From a position of power, though, I would suggest that there is a break in your own head between the moment of the insult and you leaving the room. If at all possible. It really depends on the insult, but if at all possible, try not to tie it to the insult, because then they'll have all sorts of stories in their head like, oh, it worked.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
Try and tie that to a different
we're gonna
reason.
have to wrap up now. We could carry on talking about this there's so much to continue to discuss, and I hope, Keld, in our continued series, we will do so. And Sharon, we'd love to have you back to talk more about all of these things. Thank you so much to both of you for your wisdom and expertise, and for the fun and laughter that we've had through the course of this last hour as well. It's been great, but most importantly, that sage piece of advice to breathe low and slow. Thank you, Sharon, very much. Keld, as ever, it's wonderful to spend this time with you. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.